Welcome to our channel. Today, we're exploring gripping stories of survival, recounting the closest moments people have come to losing their lives. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating content. In my junior year of college, I started passing blood in my stool. Black stools, and the toilet bowl full of blood. I went to the health center on campus, and they sent me to the ER. Test after test, they didn't know what was wrong, but my iron levels were low and my hemoglobin levels were too. They gave me Nexium and sent me home. I was fine for about a month, then all of a sudden I started passing blood again. I went in again, and more tests were done, endoscopy, colonoscopy, barium fluid tests, and more, and I found nothing. Finally, one test showed that I had something called Meckel's diverticulum, which is basically an extra flap in the small intestine that I was born with. Less than 1% of the population has it. That flap of intestine had become ulcerated and was secreting acid, which was causing me to bleed internally and lose lots of blood. While in my hospital room, I got up to go to the bathroom, and I was passing lots and lots of blood. I passed so much blood that I started getting really dizzy, and I hit the nurse button. The nurse came in, and as I saw her, I passed out onto the bathroom floor of my hospital room. When I came home about 30 seconds later, they had called a code blue, and there were tons of nurses in my room helping me back to the bed. They called for emergency surgery to remove the section of ulcerated intestine and reattach the two ends. 2 years later, I am at 100% health, with a tremendous amount of respect for nurses, doctors, and surgeons. Yesterday when I left work and called my girlfriend, she was at Westchester Park with her children. I drove to her house, changed into my gym clothes, and ran the half-mile to the park. When I got to the park I noticed two black males hanging out, smoking and spitting chew on one of the children's hub centers for the playground equipment. My girlfriend, Bridget, and her children were the only ones in the park. I wanted to say something about smoking on the playground, but my better judgment said to leave it alone. We went to an area away from where they were sitting, when Bridget announced to the kids they had 10 minutes before we went home. Upon hearing this, the two males got up and vanished, cutting through people's yards, splitting up and one running off through the middle of the houses on the street. A few more people showed up in the meantime. 4 punk kids smoking cigarettes, a family of 4 having a picnic, and a 40-something man with his granddaughter. 10 minutes came, and we began to leave. Walking into an isolated parking lot of a church, the two males showed up behind us. Each had a long, crescent wrench in hand. Bridget was going to keep walking. I turned around, pulled out my cell phone, dialed 911, and hit dial. I told her to stop, and as loud as I could, I yelled the following: "You run," to Bridget, and I will call 911. Immediately they shifted direction and walked in the direction we were going home but away from us. Bridget was determined to walk home. I told her they would be waiting for us and we were going back to the park where we would be safe with people around. I went to warn the grandfather with his daughter, and he offered us a ride home. Bridget was adamant about not taking help, but I made her do it. I was not about to be ambushed on the walk back. Full disclosure, Bridget has a special needs child in a wheelchair. Bridget is 3 months pregnant with my twin Smile. She was a perfect victim, unable to run, defenseless. When I arrived they shifted their plan to target me, and then go after her. Being safe goes beyond work, it is part of our daily lives. If you ignore the things around you, it is easy to become a victim. They didn't need weapons to assault her, but they did, to try to make me a victim. In all honesty, we got lucky, and if Bridget had not told me they were behind us, things would not have turned out the same. Be aware. Stay in sight. You won't be attacked in a crowded area. Keep a legal weapon for self-defense. I have always been opposed to owning guns before this point in my life, but I guarantee you I will have one for Bridget once the permit is signed. I was all by myself after wandering away from a party in the woods. I found myself on a secluded beach where I lit up a massive joint and smoked the whole thing, after imbibing God knows how much booze. After a short while, I felt a stomach demon churning, and before I knew it, up it came, or at least, up it tried to come. The joint had dried out my mouth and throat, and as it turned out, my vomit as well. It got caught in my throat, and I found myself completely unable to breathe. There was nobody anywhere near me, and I couldn't make a sound. I struggled and flailed, but nothing was working. I remember my head getting swimmy and thinking that I'd give it one more push and then give up. It must have worked, because I woke up some time later to find myself surrounded by a pack of stray dogs. Some were feasting on the massive pile of vomit beside me while others were licking it off my face and body. In my somewhat delirious state, my reaction to this was to freak the fuck out. I started screaming and flailing my limbs to get them off me, which didn't sit all that well with them. They began to growl and then attack me, and I received several bites as I scrambled to my feet and tried to run away. I got about 3 paces when I tripped on a rock and hit my head on another rock. So now I've got a generous amount of blood gushing out of a head wound, mixing with the vomit and dog saliva, while the dogs continue to attack me as I lay there curled in a ball and screaming nonstop. At this point, some friends from the party come running up and scare the dogs away. I can clearly remember the expression on their faces when they got a good look at me. It was at that point that I realized I had shited myself. When I was 17, I dumbly took a mystery pill at this girl's house, which I was told contained DXM. Within 25 minutes, I could not move and could not see. I passed out and slept for about 12 hours. I woke up, still could not see, stumbled up the stairs, ran into the girl's mother, muttered some gibberish, and took the longest pee of my life. I went back down and went to sleep for another 10 hours or more. I woke up, still unable to see, and felt as if my mind and body had been destroyed. Now that I had been gone for 2 days, my parents were starting to worry and told me to get home now. I made the dumbest and scariest drive of my life to my house, told them I was tired, and went to bed. I woke up to banging on my door. My parents said they had been trying to wake me up for a half hour. I lied, telling them I stayed up all night and was tired. After almost 72 hours of sleeping on and off, I woke up on Sunday morning with my vision returning to me. I have no idea how close I was to death, but it was the closest I've ever felt to physical death. I still don't know what I took that day, but from that day forward, I researched every substance I put in my body in great detail and have become much more cautious with what I do or take. I had just filled the tank in my tiny Fiat 124 Spider and was driving home. As I approached the stoplights at the intersection at the top of the hill near my neighborhood, the lights turned yellow. I was very familiar with those specific signal light intervals, and I knew that my peppy little sports car could easily beat the impending red light, yet unusually, since I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere specific, I lifted my foot off of the gas to stop for the yellow light before it turned red, as we're always supposed to do. At that moment, while my signal was still yellow, a much larger Plymouth Duster full of teens blasted up over the hill and through the intersection, running their red light, right through the space I would have occupied if I had followed my usual impulse to gun it and speed through the intersection on yellow. They would have T-boned my car right in the driver's door. There is no doubt in my mind that I would have been killed in the collision that, luckily for me, didn't occur that day. When I was a toddler, I had a series of petit mal seizures over the course of a year or so. During these, I would space out, my eyes would glaze over, and then I'd stop breathing. However, they only lasted 30 to 60 seconds, and I would start breathing normally again within a minute or so. My pediatrician, a very old school doctor, told my parents that these weren't anything too serious, just something that a small percentage of children experienced and that I would eventually grow out of. One night, while watching TV with my folks, I was about 2 at the time, I had a fit and stopped breathing. My parents waited for a whole agonizing minute, but I never started again. Then I started turning blue. My dad freaked out, bundled me up, and rushed me out to that car. In retelling the story later, he said he did about 100 miles per hour and ran several red lights to get me to the ER. En route, about 3 minutes later, I started breathing again on my own. That was the last of the seizures I ever experienced. I've had no other history of epilepsy or other abnormal side effects from those spells. I was standing outside, smoking a cigarette, when I heard some sirens coming down the street. I live in downtown Memphis, so I figured it was just a normal Thursday night, but then I heard a police helicopter over the sirens and figured something was up. 6 to 10 police cars, undercover cars, and police SUVs, in addition to the helicopter, we are chasing this guy down one of the busiest roads in Memphis. The police cars had him basically boxed in. Then I heard 2 or 3 quick bursts. But, before I heard the second shot, I felt and heard this PFFFFTTT go over my shoulder and next to my head. I'm pretty sure it was a bullet. I immediately dropped to the ground and burned my arm on my cigarette. After that, I guess the police got tired of him and lit his car up. There was just a lot of gunfire, and then the guy's car stopped. The strangest thing was that there were some kids outside from a party at my apartments, and after the first shot rang out, they ran up to the fence to see what was going on. These kids ran towards gunfire. We had a big ice storm several years ago. My little house lost electricity, and we were in an old neighborhood that was known for being out for days at a time when stuff like this happened. We decided to go stay at my mom's. She still had power. But we couldn't get out of the driveway because of a huge tree branch that had fallen across it and was covered in ice. I knew I couldn't lift it, I had no chainsaw, so I tied a rope to the very end of it and tried to pull and just swing it wide enough we could get through. But it wouldn't budge. So I went out, gently squatted down because the ground was so icy, untied the rope from it, and walked back to the garage to think. I only made it about 10 steps away and heard cracking, then boom. Another huge branch from the tree, about 8 inches in diameter, including its icy shell, crashed down right where I had been sitting less than 10 seconds ago. If I had still been there, I would have never gotten out of the way on the ice in time. At worst, I'd be dead, and at best, I'd be in a wheelchair. I had a kidney transplant in 2001, and personally, I never felt close to death. I was ill, but it was managed, dialysis. In 2003, I felt ill. Really ill. I'd been camping with friends, and for the whole weekend I felt off. I got home on the bank holiday Monday and saw my GP first thing on Tuesday. I was diagnosed with flu-like symptoms and a possible throat infection and was given nothing. Please note here that I live in the UK, so anything prescribed would have been covered by my prepayment certificate. I don't get drugs for free, and generally, when anything is wrong, I get drugs to help, or at least a blood test. I get nothing. A week later, after a week off work, as a temp, I go back to my GP. Yes, you have flu-like symptoms and a throat infection. Go home and sleep. My mom takes me to my renal doctor, 13 miles away, where I get a blood test. They tell me I'm severely dehydrated, give me a drip, and tell me to go home to rest. A few hours later, 4 a.m., we get a call from the nurse. We have to rush to the local hospital. My potassium was at 9.8 mg/L, which is a lethal level. My heart shouldn't have been beating. I was passing in and out of consciousness. While I was awake, I was telling my sobbing mother, who donated my kidney, to go home and sleep. I had blood taken from my groin and was rushed to the ARC the next day. The acute renal clinic while I was awake and locally numb, they inserted a neckline and gave me emergency hemodialysis. I spent the next 31 days having a battery of blood tests, dialysis, and biopsies, freaked out after my first one, passed out. I had my neckline changed twice and had a chest line put in, which involved me being awake while a tube was put into my chest or heart. While on dialysis, my nurse removed the bubble filter. A huge air bubble was heading into my chest, into my brain or heart, not sure which, and I freaked out. I swore at her and had a panic attack. There's more to this story, but it takes a while. The driver of a car I was in almost did. We were going to a younger friend's 21st birthday at midnight, we didn't even have a single drink yet, and we were going to pull onto the highway. After we both looked, I am the worst backseat driver. I can attest that the headlights from the truck blended almost perfectly into where billboard lights would normally have been. As we started to cross at a slower pace, we heard the screeches of brakes. We both insta said, "Oh, schvive it." And out of reaction, since Hess a moto racer, he downshifted and punched it. The truck smashed behind the driver's side, and we spun 540 degrees in the blink of an eye. Interesting part, the MTX amp in the trunk that we mounted a few months ago blew out the back of the car and rolled approximately 4 blocks. We found it, then tested it out, and it still worked. We wrote MTX, and they were so amazed that they had us send the amp back, post the story on their website, and send us a new one. Oh yeah, only a few broken ribs. My near-death experience was more the fault of my own stupidity than anything else. I was at a bonfire with a bunch of friends, and we were all drinking and having a great time. Well, I was pretty hammered, and at the time, I thought it would be a brilliant idea to kick a jug of gasoline into the fire. Of course, when I kicked it, it burst into flames, spraying gasoline everywhere. Burning gasoline splashed all over my leg, and I went into a panic for a moment. I couldn't comprehend that I was on fire and that I was in danger. Within the space of seconds, my best friend literally hit me with a flying tackle, overdramatic, right? And put the fire out. Luckily, I was wearing shorts at the time, and I only suffered second-degree burns on my ankle. I realized that if I had been wearing pants or if it had splashed somewhere else on me, I probably would have burned to death or been even more badly injured. Since that day, I have not attended any bonfires or raging parties with alcohol. This SHT really put my life into perspective and taught me that I couldn't go around acting stupid like I used to. It was a real learning experience for me. I was driving down this one-lane windy road with a cliff on one side after an 8-hour shift working as a lift operator at a ski resort. It was an hour-and-a-half commute to work. But free season passes, I guess I took a turn a little wide. The back right tire of my truck went off the pavement and into the dirt pullout, sending the tail of my truck into a spin along the dirt. Imagine traveling horizontal down the road, while my front tires were still on the pavement. I did all the usual things to get out of a spin, neutral, turn into the spin to regain control, etc. But when I got back onto the road, I was in the oncoming lane around a blind turn. I swerved back into my lane just as a car came around the corner. I think we missed a head-on collision by about 4 feet. I nearly shit myself, and my buddy in the passenger seat starts laughing. I wanted to punch him in the face. Later, I realized that, if you're going to die, why not go out laughing? But at that moment, there are no words for my anger. I had 2 near-death experiences, not the floating out of body kind, but the nearly dead kind. 1, aged about 8, I was swimming in Western Australia. I was swept out into deep water by a rip. I wasn't noticed drifting away. I went unconscious in the water. I woke up in an ambulance, where they'd been resuscitating me. 2, I grew up in a family of toe cutters. Debt collectors. The big ones use 15 inches ball-peen hammers to encourage you to pay up what you owe. I was around 15, 6 feet 5 inches tall, height works well for this work, at the time, and was along with my oldest brother on a job to collect and encourage someone to pay up for a pound of smoke they owed someone. We were contractors, I guess. Anyway, I'll skip a lot of this, as it's not important to the story. Suffice it to say that we hastily worked this guy over. He could still walk, but he couldn't do anything useful with his arms. In our hastiness to get the job done, we neglected to realize that the guy's girlfriend had kept quiet and snuck up behind me. She must have been hiding in another room. We'd usually have one person check out the house while the other keeps the person we're after, so to speak. It turns out she was wielding a large knife, a folding tiger knife, which she quickly drew across my throat from behind. She'd assumed we'd taken her partner out and were getting revenge. She ran from the house, and my brother raced to me and put pressure on my neck. It had missed my carotid, but she'd still opened my neck up badly, and I was bleeding out a lot. My brother raced me to the hospital, made up a story about me catching it on a squid boat's hull line. We were squid boat fishermen by trade, and I was patched up. Not before flooding my breathing tubes, I can't remember the name, in my throat with blood and having to get a tracheotomy, I think that's the term, so I could get oxygen. I was kept in for 2 days. They'd had to do surgery to get everything patched up after the initial duct taping up of my neck, but then I was released. I never did find out the chick's name. She wasn't our problem. She was in the right doing what she did. I'd have done the same. I don't blame anyone for defending themselves. It wasn't often they could, so a fair call on using a blade. I'm not proud of my teenage years or the work I did with my 2 brothers. That day was an eye-opener. We never attempted murder or anything, but the fear and pain we put people through were palpable. I got a first-hand lesson in that same fear and pain. A glimpse into what we were inflicting on others. We continued doing what we did, though we were a lot more careful about ourselves and careful with what happened to people. Rather than the person giving us the job dictating what they wanted done, we dictated to them what we'd do. I was walking to class on a snowy day, earbuds in ears, loud music on, and wasn't really paying attention to anything. I got to the crosswalk of a busy street where I needed to cross. I saw that the cross traffic had a red light, meaning that people were either in the process of crossing or had just finished crossing. There were some other pedestrians waiting at the curb, but I saw the crosswalk indicator as a red hand flashing, with the timer counting down from 15 seconds. I thought, hey, I can make it across in 15 seconds. I don't know why these losers are just waiting here on the curb, and quicken my pace. About midway through the crosswalk, I heard a loud horn, looked up and to my left, and saw the fire truck. Cue massive deer in headlights moment before I dashed forward and into the gutter. It was a busy road, and the fire truck hadn't even seen me in time to stop or slow down. Streets were wet from snow melting, and had I stayed where I was standing for even half a second longer, I probably would have been hit. Possibly even more frightening than the fact that I could have been hit is the possibility that I could have slipped and fallen on the slippery wet asphalt and been crushed underneath. Once I made it to the other curb and thought to myself, I could have just died moments ago, I also realized that the driver was probably thinking, I could have killed that guy at the same time. I've never experienced it, but I'm guessing that I could have killed someone is a worse feeling than I could have died. I felt pretty lousy after that, as I'm sure that the guy driving the fire truck has a stressful enough job as it is, and putting him in a position where he could have killed someone probably didn't make his day any better. I thought about making a call or writing a letter to the fire department, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that might not have been a huge issue, and I also didn't want to put the guy in a spot by letting one of the higher-ups know that a pedestrian had almost been killed by a fire truck. In case the driver happens to be reading this, I sincerely apologize for making your job more stressful than I'm sure it already is. I'm sorry for being such a dumbass, and I've made a much more concerted effort to remain cognizant of my surroundings as a pedestrian, especially in busy areas. 5 years ago, I woke up one morning with a horrendous pain in my upper left leg, which caused me to pass out immediately if I stepped on it. It was misdiagnosed as a trapped nerve by the doctor, who gave me anti-inflammatories and sent me home. 3 days later, it was no better, and I also had horrendous breathlessness, so at the insistence of NHS 24, who I kind of credit with my life, I was taken into the hospital, where it was transcribed that I had a blood clot and I'd had a pulmonary embolism on my lungs. Because of the pulmonary embolism, doctors told me that had I come in 6 hours later, I would not have made it. Daily injections of heparin for a week, plus 6 months of anti-clotting drugs, as well as never being able to take the birth control pill ever again, as they determined this is what had caused it, and I'm fine now. But when I think about how close it could have been, it's pretty scary. My 3 friends and I had the day off from school due to snow, and we were driving to a neighboring city for some reason. I was in the front passenger seat. I look behind me at my 2 friends in the back seat and notice that they aren't wearing their seat belts. I say, "Hey, you should put your seat belts on." Them, "No, they're uncomfortable." So I quip back, "You know what's uncomfortable? A body cast." I watch as they begrudgingly put their seat belts on. I turn back around and barely have time to giggle at my sharp wit or appreciate that the Backstreet Boys were playing on the radio for the first time in forever. Because all of a sudden my friend who's driving is screaming and the car starts swerving. We fishtail and start to slide in one direction, towards what we know is a 30-foot drop-off. Suddenly, the car flips around and slides in the other direction, towards a bunch of trees. We start sliding at like 45 miles per hour towards this tree. As I'm sitting in the front seat, I can see that we're about to hit it. It gets closer and closer, and my last thought was, I wonder if the airbags will deploy? We crash into the tree, and it promptly cracks in half, then falls directly on top of our car. The roof caves in right between all our heads. We walked away with a few bruises, and I had some killer backlash the next day, but other than that, we were all fine. When I traveled to Germany, we stopped at the Black Forest to eat and explore some local shops. As soon as we pulled into the parking lot, I had my sights set on a bridge that went over the valley. I thought I would sneak off and climb the side of the mountain, get on the bridge, and then yell down to my girlfriend. After getting on the bridge and walking almost to the center of it, where it was at least a 100-foot drop, I heard one of the most frightening sounds of my life. A train horn. I looked behind me, and I could see a large red train barreling out of a hole in the side of the mountain. I quickly calculated that I would not have time to run to either side before the train caught up to me. The railings on this bridge were only about 3 to 3.5 feet high, as this was not a bridge intended for pedestrians. The railing was old, rusted, and not very sturdy. I grabbed onto it, leaned over the edge, and knelt down as much as I could in the 1.5-foot space I had between me and the tracks. The train flew by, honking its horn the whole way. It was terrifyingly loud. After the train passed, I nearly collapsed on the tracks. My whole body felt like jello, like the greatest sense of relief I have ever experienced. I had to concentrate to walk back to the side of the mountain where my girlfriend had just finally made it up. We were 17 and 18 at the time. I told her what happened, and we stood there and smoked a "Yay, I didn't die" cigarette. After a few minutes, we noticed a helicopter doing very wide circles overhead and was fairly low. After the 3rd pass, I started getting suspicious and told my girlfriend that the helicopter was probably looking for me. Before the chopper came back for a 4th pass, we started making our way down through the forest. The helicopter came back and hovered directly over the trees where we were. We dove down, and I snapped some pictures of it. We made it back down to the buildings where everyone else on the tour was, and everyone had come outside to see what was up with the helicopter flying around so low in the area. We were scared at this point, so we hopped back on the tour bus, hoping it would leave before anything happened. 10 minutes later, German military officers came on board the bus and took my girlfriend and me off. Long story short, I had to give them my address and other information because they said I could be fined for making the train slow down, or according to them, I made the train stop, although that is untrue. Anyway, I still can't believe that happened to me when I think about it 4 years later. It would have been a shitty way to die. When I was 17, I got dumped by a girl and, fucking stupidly, took 3/4 of a bottle of Tylenol 3 with codeine. I was, or should I say what I thought was, deeply in love, even though I wouldn't actually find love until a few years later. Anyway, after I popped the last pill, I went to bed. Amazingly enough, I woke up the next day feeling as bad as I have ever felt in my life. I worked at a hospital, lucky enough, and drove into work for the early shift at 6 a.m., stopping all along the way to get sick. When I got to work, my boss told me I looked gray, and after I puked again, she told me to go to the emergency room. I told the doctor what I did, and they pumped my stomach. There's nothing worse than I have ever experienced than having my stomach pumped, the thick plastic clear hose they put in your throat, the taste of the liquid charcoal in your mouth. Just awful. The doctors said that I was lucky that I woke up at all that morning, and even luckier that I didn't pass out while I was driving to work. That's as close as I've ever come. Me and my friends used to hang out at this waterfall that was randomly hidden off the side of an old country road. We would smoke bud, drink beer, and have campfires. There normally wasn't much water going over the falls, but it had rained a shit ton the night before, so there was a nice rushing river leading up to the falls. My friend Seth was trying to cross the river upstream when he lost his footing and slipped in the river. Granted, the water was only about 3 to 4 feet deep, but the rocks were covered in moss, which made them slippery. In a matter of seconds, he was swept to the edge of the water. He scraped his hands and nails into the rocks, trying with all his might to keep from going over the edge. Finally, with his legs nearly over the falls, he found a handhold and held on for dear life until we managed to pull him out. When we pulled him out, his hands were really bloody, and some of his nails were missing because he had tried to grasp at the rock so hard. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and it could have easily ended in death. The lesson to be learned here is, don't ever underestimate the power of water, and certainly don't fuck around in the water leading up to a waterfall. I've had it bad since the beginning. In the womb, during birth, I got wrapped up in the umbilical cord. My heart stopped beating for a long time. They had to do an emergency C-section. 6 years old, I was sick. A red dot appeared on my cheek and kept growing larger. I ended up with a 106.8 degree fever. I was hallucinating and got rushed to the hospital. Doctors and nurses stripped me naked and threw me into a tub full of ice water. It turns out it was bacterial meningitis. Shit could have been really bad, like the other poster who had it, but I managed to recover with no lingering effects. 15 years old, severe and sudden asthma attack. I ended up losing consciousness and only remember waking up in the hospital a day or so later. According to those who saw me, I was turning purple and was just barely breathing when they brought me into the hospital. When I was 20, I got T-boned while making a left turn. It was, mostly, my fault. I was making a left turn out of my work parking lot. The street had 4 lanes, and where I was turning out, there was a left turn lane as well. Traffic was really backed up, and a few people waved me through to make the left turn. I went through. The left turn lane was clear, and it would have been fine, as traffic was backed up extremely far, way past where you could get in the left turn lane. However, with the light being red and no traffic coming in the opposing lanes, someone, a young girl, decided to drive about a quarter of a mile in the wrong lane of traffic to get to the left turn lane. She was going about 60. Right as the front of my car peeked out, she nailed me. The car was demolished, the whole front section, engine, and everything were gone. Of all the things I've mentioned, this was the least serious in terms of injury. I walked away with no injuries other than burns or scrapes on my face from the airbag. However, I consider this the closest to death, because if I had been 3 feet further, she would have hit me directly, and there's no chance I would have survived that. I was deployed in Iraq, and we were doing our rotation in the forward operating base that was located inside one of the towns in our area of responsibility. It was late, and I had just come off a guard shift, so I was lying down on a cot outside of my vehicle. We saw a flash that lit up the sky and then heard the explosion of an RPG being fired. Sometimes they would use the rockets like mortars or artillery, firing them up in the air so they would fall down on us from above. The first round landed somewhere outside the camp, and I did a kind of meh and laid back down as I was used to hearing booms and shit by then. As soon as my head hit the cot, it happened again, so a couple of us got inside the vehicle just to be safe. A short time after the round was fired, we began to hear a spinning sound coming from over our heads. I remember it sounded just like one of these had been thrown at me. This means we were very nearly in the direct path of the round. We got down and remembered cursing very loudly, and then silence. We got out of the vehicle, trying to figure out how we weren't dead. The round didn't detonate because the guy didn't take out the safety pin before he fired it, and it landed a few feet from our vehicle and skipped harmlessly into the river behind us. Remote part of West Tanzania. Mud shack village, 2 days of train rides from anywhere. No electricity, no water, no car. I took antimalarials religiously but still fell ill. I walked to the nearest dispensary, where they gave me fake metakelphin, unbeknownst to me at the time. Obviously, I did nothing. The condition deteriorated, breathing worsened, and blood pressure dropped fast. The passing 4x4 stopped off to pick up some supplies. A friend convinced them to take me to the nearest hospital, 4-hour rough drive, in exchange for cash. I got to the hospital and was again diagnosed with falciparum malaria. Hospital lacking basic hygiene, no running water, electricity, or windows. Blood all up walls. Given quinine IVs for 24 hours. Unfortunately, I was given an overdose by unqualified staff, nasty stuff, very toxic. Heart beginning to slow or stop. Breathing worsens or becomes semi-conscious. Bundled onto the nearest plane by friend to a better hospital. Arrive at a new hospital with very modern, latest equipment. Treatment given. Unfortunately, I developed pneumonia while there. Stay for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, people develop salmonella from hospital food. Fly back to the UK to try and get better help. 15 months later, still not well, but getting there. About 15 years ago, while I was in college, I was riding my motorcycle home while it was raining. A motorist changed lanes without seeing me, clipped my bike, and sent me tumbling down a mountain. My head managed to break my fall by landing on a rock. I was in the ICU for a couple of weeks, with all kinds of tubes going into my body. I was pretty much surviving because of machines. The hospital couldn't find any of my relatives. Mostly because they are deadbeats, and I gave up on my family as soon as I turned 18. The doctor then felt it was in his best interest to let me die. They call it slow coding. By a giant string of luck, one of my roommates and his father came by one last time to see me before the holidays. His father was a JD/MD and happened to notice what was going on. I didn't know his father too well, but he had the presence of mind to ask about my DNR. Being 25, I didn't have one, and obviously the staff couldn't produce it. After a lot of threats and yelling, I got a new care team, and I came 3 days later. That was Christmas morning. Hence the username. I've got some memory problems, and I can't move my fingers, but it's way better than being dead. Thanks, Dr. Asshole. We ended up suing the hospital. I got a boatload of money, but the important thing is that the doctors and nursing staff will never practice medicine in the US again. Okay. So it's early fall 2008. I'm a month or two into college, and my high school girlfriend is about a week into her college career as well. I went to a school in central New Jersey, she was in Philadelphia. I go to visit her on her first, or second, weekend there because she's feeling a bit overwhelmed. Offhand, she mentions that Barack Obama is giving a speech in West Philadelphia, in Born and Raised, the next day, so we both resolve to go. We head out to the speech. It was pretty cool, and afterward, we decided we'd like to try to get close enough to Obama for a crappy cell phone shot. The throng of people was way too thick, so we figure we'll circle around the block and try to head him off at the pass. We get about 3/4 of the way around the block and go to cross the street to get to where we figured Obama would soon be retreating. We start to cross, and I look to my right and see about 7 SUVs, a couple buses, and some cop cars barreling towards us, not stopping. I step back out of the way, but my girlfriend keeps walking. I see her almost too late, run back into the street, grab her, and push her back to safety right as the first SUV storms by, missing me by inches. Now here's the kicker, I look into the back seat of that SUV, and I shit you not, it was Barack Obama, just coldly staring at me. As soon as I make eye contact with him, he gives me a little nod, and before I can get my girlfriend's attention, she was too focused on the trivial almost dying thing. The SUV is a block away and Obama is out of sight. I had just gotten out of work and was riding my motorcycle down a busy road. Being a little excited, anyone else get that second wind feeling when you get out of work? I sped up to catch a light and then tossed it into 6th gear with the intention of slowing to cruising speed. As I come up to the next light, I see a car stopped at the green light in front of me. I try to accelerate to pass a truck next to me when they speed up to prevent me from changing lanes. Being in 6th gear, I had no torque to speed up quickly and was going too fast to slow down or stop before hitting the car in front of me. I panicked, grabbed a handful of front brakes, and took a swan dive over my handlebars at about 60 miles per hour. I was wearing a helmet, thankfully, but no other gear. I kept my limbs tucked while I tumbled over and over across the asphalt. Shit just slowed way down as I tumbled. I was tumbling on top of the white line in between the lanes, and I could see car tires inches from my face on both sides. The truck that denied me my lane change took off, and people barely swerved to avoid running me over as I tumbled down the road. Adrenaline kicked in, and I recovered from the tumble into a walk and got out of the road. I get back to my bike, lying in the road about 25 yards from where I ended up picking it up to roll it out of the road, spraining my ankle in the process. At this point, a couple of coworkers who happened to be behind me when it happened ran up, asking if I was okay. I didn't feel a thing, but it turned out I broke 3 ribs, sprained my ankle, and had a ton of road rash. My pants were ripped to shreds and covered in blood. I've since gotten a new bike, but I've given up my squiddy ways and always wear a full set of gear. My helmet saved my life for sure, as the face shield was shattered and there were gouges all over the helmet. I learned a valuable lesson that day. When I was 17, a new driver, I was driving toward an intersection, in my Death Trap 1962 Bug with no seat belts. I had a green light, and I noticed a big 80s Cadillac coming like a bat out of hell on my left toward the red light that he had. I knew he was going to run it and T-bone me, so I fucking stood up on the brake pedal. I would have stopped right in his path, so I steered left towards him, because if I went right, he would have still hit me. I came within feet of getting crushed, but now I was on the other side of the road, heading toward oncoming traffic. So I swerved back to the right after the red light runner had passed and stopped within inches of the curb. When I got out of the car, I was fucking shaking so hard. My friend in the car was screaming the whole time. LOL. I left my beer alone outside for about 15 minutes while I went to water the bushes. Came back and chugged down the rest. It turns out wasps like beer. Can was full of them. Stung in the throat, swelling, hospital. Crossing an off-ramp to go help someone having car trouble. I didn't look to see if there was anyone coming. A split second after I'd crossed, the car passed behind me, going 60 kilometers per hour. I hit a tree while skiing and then fell into the 30-foot deep tree well. If nobody had seen me go down, I'd have been trapped. I was driving on a 2-lane backwoods country road with a lot of blind corners. Some idiot coming in the opposite direction figured it would be easier to take the sharp, let's not forget blind, corners if she used both lanes. I was going about 70 km, she was going faster. We both lost our driver's side mirrors. Dumb bitch didn't even stop. I fell 50 feet out of a tree and landed on my back. The big kid at the public pool held me underwater till I inhaled. I woke up on the pool deck coughing up water after receiving I overdosed on asthma medication at age 5. I almost drank myself to death in college. Chainsaw accident. Fell off a jet ski about 30 kilometers from shore. Jet ski just kept on going. Picked up by other jet skiers some time later. Quebec ice storm 98. Just because there's no power in the neighborhood doesn't mean that the down power lines on the lawn are dead. I slept with the wrong guy's girlfriend. I was told it was really weak LSD. While on the subject of drugs, I drank too much coke one night. I thought I could ride a dirt bike. In a field in a thunderstorm, I lay down when the hair on my neck started standing up. Bolt hit a tree at the edge of the field. I don't know how near death that really was, but I felt lucky afterwards. Messing around near the train tracks, buddy pulled that saved your life joke but almost failed. This is probably the closest he came to dying too. Further explanation is here for future reference. I was about 13 years old and walking around the woods swinging an axe over my head and into downed trees and other debris when I came upon a mostly deflated basketball. Knowing that I had the superhuman strength to propel the double-sided axe through the puny defenses of my rubber foe, I raised my weapon, John Henry style, over my head and came down with the force of 1,000 thunders. My axe bounced, of course, off of the latex beast and began to track back and up toward the cranium, which cradled the gift to humanity, which was my 13-year-old brain. The axe seemed to be moving in slow motion as my synapses burned and fired in just enough time to tell my dumb ass to move my enormous head out of the way. It is still debatable as to whether this turned out for good or ill. Sela. When I was in 2nd grade, I was at soccer practice. I had just recently had my cast removed from a broken arm. I re-broke the arm at practice. The newly broken arm looked a little like the St. Louis Arch. My parents took me to the hospital, where I was put into an exam room. The nurse put a blood pressure cuff on my arm, and an anesthesiologist injected my arm with a dose of lidocaine for the pain. After half an hour, my arm was good and numb. They removed the blood pressure cuff. I blacked out. I'm told that within a minute of them removing the cuff, I had 2 seizures and had to be intubated, SP? I was life-flighted to a children's hospital, where I died on the 10-minute chopper ride and was zapped back to life as the chopper landed. I was in a coma for 3 days. When I awoke, everything was covered in Tweety birds, and I was the grumpiest kid alive, according to my parents. The hospital footed the bill for the ordeal because they weren't supposed to remove the blood pressure cuff. A bunch of friends and I planned a trip up to North Carolina, from Florida, to go snowboarding, and I had to rent a car, so I went to the nearest budget car rental and asked for a car that would sufficiently make it through snowy roads. The car rental girl said, "No problem." On the day of the trip, I pick up the car, and it's a freaking Kia Rondo, which isn't a bad car but definitely not made to handle rough terrain. My 2 other friends who were riding with me convinced me that we should be okay. Fast forward to NC, we are looking for the cabin, and the GPS is leading us up a snowy mountain. It then tells us to go up a steep road that is covered in snow. To the left of the road is the mountain, and to the right, the road just drops off. This road had no guardrails on the side, and if you looked over the edge, you could see the ground maybe 200 feet below. The road then takes a sharp left and steepens. As I go up this steep road, the Kia stops in its tracks. My friends, taking their cue from the GPS, say, "It's further up," and I tell them, "I know that, but the car will not move." The car then starts to slide backwards towards the edge of the cliff, about where I turned left. Being from Florida, I have never really driven through snow, so I was inexperienced, and everything I tried didn't work. We just kept sliding backwards. I then say in my most calm voice possible, "Are you guys ready to jump?" As the car continues to slide to the edge. The back of the car is about 3 feet from the edge, and the doors of the Kia are open with us ready to jump when suddenly the car stops. My friends are freaking out, and I calm them down and tell them that I can get us out of this. I turn the wheel, and the car moves with just barely enough room away from the edge, and then, remaining as calm as possible, I reverse the car back down the road. When we get back down to the level part of the road, we call our friends and ask how the hell we're supposed to get to the cabin. It turns out that the road we were on was supposed to be closed during harsh weather and that our GPS was taking us in the wrong direction, which explains why there were no cars going our way. I like swords a lot. When I went to Toledo, Spain, I of course had to get one, famous Toledo steel and all. I made sure to find a local craftsman who made them himself, as opposed to the junk tourist stuff in the hot spots that you can find on the internet, which wouldn't be good for anything. It's a short sword, but still fairly long, about 3 feet or so, because that's the biggest I could fit into my suitcase. It works great for me, as I am a fairly small girl. Edited to add admittedly shitty cell phone pics. As I bought it new from the smith, it had never been sharpened, and so it was very thick at the edges. I decided to leave it that way because I am in theater and might use it as a prop someday for stage combat. A never sharpened sword is always still way duller than a dulled sword that has been sharpened, so I figured why ruin the safety factor? It'd be slightly less cool than keeping it battle ready, but I do theater all the time, and it's come in handy. Fast forward to the next summer. I'm at my mom's place, on summer break, heaving some boxes around. I toss down a particularly heavy one without looking at what I was tossing it on to, and all of a sudden my sword comes flashing up in a terrifying arc. Apparently I had thrown the box just barely onto the hilt of the sword, and as it was a perfectly balanced sword, it came levering up and over at me with rather scary force. It hit me from my shoulder across my entire chest and more. The force was strong enough that even though it never sharpened, the tip cut into my shoulder, and the blade left a huge welt from my shoulder across my chest diagonally down to about a few inches below my armpit. Had my sword been sharpened, I would be dead. I was home alone, my mom had just left for work and wouldn't be back for 9 hours, and my cell phone was dead in my purse in another room. I'd have bled out, especially as I have low blood pressure and am mildly anemic. Even if it had been sharpened and dulled, it likely would have slashed me open, as the tip did, the tip being inherently more sharp because it's thinner. Imagine that, though, hey, in a funny way. A dead girl was slashed open by a sword, with no evidence of anyone else around, and from an angle that it would have been impossible to generate the necessary force to hack herself up. Would have been kind of neat. When I was a senior in high school, I was working at Toys R Us. My lower back was constantly hurting a few months into working there. I got an MRI done, and it looked like there was tissue crawling up my spine and pulling it down. So we head to Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, where they do surgery to cut the tissue away from my nerves. So they sew me back up, and I go home to rehab, learning how to walk again, doing rehab in a pool, and whatnot. I finally get back to school, and I'm in honors government on the computer when I get the worst headache of my life. I black out, but only for about 2 seconds, and it passes. Weird, I thought. So it's time to go, and some guy goes, "Mape guy, your back is soaking wet." I reach back, and my leather belt, shirt, and jeans are soaked. What do I think? I drive home, not a good idea in retrospect, and ask my mom to take a look. She looks at my incision, and she says it looks like I'm leaking water out of my back. She calls the doctor and tells them what's up. They say to get to the ER within 5 minutes because I'm leaking spinal fluid. The hospital is 4 hours away. Oh shit, my dad rushes home, and they create a bed of blankets in the back of the van. My dad makes the 4-hour trip in 2. Somehow not hitting cops, traffic, construction, nothing. I lost consciousness several times during the trip. I needed to keep my eyes closed because it didn't hurt so bad to move them back and forth. The gurney brought me in, put me under straight away, and fixed me up. I lost 3 cups of spinal fluid. That's not the bad part. After the fix-up surgery, the doctor has me bend over, and I get a spinal tap. These things hurt. As he draws out my fluid, I hear him say shit under his breath. My spinal fluid looked like watered down milk. I had fucking spinal meningitis. For the next 6 weeks, I had N4 sewn into my arm, and 3 times a day I had to use sash. I think it's saline, antibiotic, saline. I forget what the H stands for now. That was a very stressful 1.5 months of my life, and I almost died twice. I got appendicitis a few years ago in my late 20s, not a problem usually, but I didn't realize it was anything serious. I had a stomach ache and a temperature, so I thought it was food poisoning or something and just carried on with life as normal. After a week or so, I could barely walk because of the pain, and I couldn't sleep because of the temperature, so I figured I should see a doctor. She told me to get into a cab and go straight to the emergency room at a nearby hospital. When they examined me, they said that the symptoms indicated appendicitis, but they thought I wasn't telling them the full story because they didn't believe anybody would be walking around for so long in my condition. I had to convince them that no, I was not on drugs or anything, and yes, I really was stupid enough to be walking around with what turned out to be a burst appendix. After the surgeon took the thing out of me, they told me that if I had waited any longer to get to the hospital, I probably would have been in a lot more trouble. Also, I once crashed a motorcycle at 80 miles per hour on a racetrack and got hit in the neck by another bike that was right behind me. I spent the night in the hospital but escaped without any serious injuries. I survived an F4 tornado that destroyed my house and left only 3 walls standing. I cannot find an original news article, but it happened in Channelview, Texas, on September 21, 1992. Here are a few links: Houston Chronicle blog and stormtrack.org. Also, my mom and dad were on the cover of the Houston Chronicle the next day, and I have been interviewed on the anniversary of the tornado. I was watching TV while my little sister was asleep on the couch. The power went out a few times, and I didn't think anything of it. My mother came in to see if we were okay and to check on the weather when a 6-foot tree branch burst through our sliding glass window. By some miracle, the kitchen wall moved across the room and formed a protective area for us where we were huddled. The wall the couch was against was a bathroom wall, and the kitchen wall leaned against it, protecting us. I just remember huddling, praying, and the sound of 2x4s snapping like twigs. Glass is everywhere, and you do not want to experience the taste of fiberglass or pull it out of your ears and skin. I also remember the carpet being pulled from underneath us. My other, baby, sister was 1 year old and asleep in the master bedroom before the tornado. Her crib was found 2 blocks away. The master bedroom was gone. She was found only a few feet away, underneath some debris, with only a minor concussion. My younger sister, who was asleep on the couch, slept through the whole thing. About 15 years ago, I was renting a house with another guy I worked with. I went to the pub with a friend, had a few pints, and then headed back home. I had a last smoke, then went to bed. The next thing I clearly remember is that I was in an ambulance headed for the hospital. The last cigarette I'd had must have dropped hot ash down the sofa, because it smoldered for a few hours then caught fire. Horsehair, it was a pretty old sofa. My neighbor had woken up, smelled the smoke, and seen me trying to get out of the house but failing to open the windows since the landlord had painted them recently and they were stuck shut. It seems the smoke overcame me, my heart stopped, but the fire brigade got me out, and a competent ambulance lady got my heart started again, so here I still am. When I was 22, I almost died from diabetic shock. I had not previously been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, so I did not really know what was going on. For a few weeks, I was feeling sick, and then for about a week and a half, I was really dehydrated and was puking a lot. It was also affecting my mental state, so I was not thinking clearly about what was going on and was hallucinating a little. I was living alone and not having much contact with other people at that point in time, so there was no one to point out that maybe I was a little pale. I was very tired too. The effort of taking a shower meant I had to take a nap for an hour afterwards. I finally saw a doctor who took one look at me and sent me to an emergency room. I spent 3 days in the ICU and a month recuperating at my parents' house. My blood sugar was probably 700 or so, and I was in acute DKA. The ER doctor told me I would have probably died sometime in the next 24 hours without medical help. Remember, kids, when you pee every 10 minutes, it's not just annoying, it's the diabetes. When I was 4, I got sick and was misdiagnosed with the flu. A week later, I was still vomiting and barely conscious, so my mom took me back to the doctor, who had me do a simple test, sit and draw my bent knees up to my face. I screamed, and I was immediately sent to the ER. I was in a coma for 2 days, and I didn't even know until a few weeks ago that they injected my heart to keep me alive. Shudder, even worse than the thought of the multiple spinal taps I had to endure. I had bacterial meningitis, which is much rarer and more fatal than the viral meningitis that's known for going around college campuses, and simply put, I wasn't expected to live. But I managed to pull out, and all the doctors supposedly came to see the little girl who survived bacterial meningitis. My parents were relieved, but not for long. I was alive but unresponsive to sound, and my speech quickly deteriorated. All the medications they pumped into me to keep me alive left me 100% deaf. Awesome. But better deaf than dead, I always say. Maybe a year ago, the hot dog incident occurred. I was living alone at the time and was retard hungry at like 2 in the morning one night. Since my microwave was broken, I figured I would boil a hot dog. Well, in the time it takes to boil a hot dog, I fell asleep. I slept through my fire alarm and through tons of phone calls from my neighbor. My neighbor called the fire department to come save my ass. They break my door down, which I also sleep through. So basically, I wake up to some firefighters in full gear yelling at me that I have to get out of here. I said, "Who the fuck are you?" He just kind of led me out. Thank goodness I wasn't naked that night. So I am standing outside, and my neighbor comes out and hugs me, shit glad I was alive and whatnot. Another fireman comes out with the hot dog, roasted into nothing but embers. He was looking at the pan and saying, "Yep, that's a hot dog, alright." The moral of the story is that late night snacks can be killer. About a year ago, I was struck with 3 epileptic seizure attacks. I don't have epilepsy. For some reason, certain individuals are prone to seizures. Well, I woke up May 4th with my face covered in dried up blood. I had had a seizure during my sleep, and my tongue had pushed my bottom front 4 teeth forward at an impossible angle. So I ask my dad for some money, and he looks at me disgustedly and tells me to go drive to the dentist. Now, this is the dangerous part. At this point, I was capable of having a seizure at any time. Indeed, I had 2 more that day. Just picture it. I'm behind the wheel, and all of a sudden I lose control of my muscles and body. I was on the highway too. I was really lucky that day. At any rate, I get to the dentist without mishap, and my dentist is bitching at my poor oral hygiene. Everything seems to go well. I'm about to leave their office and go outside when it happens again. This was around 9 in the morning. I have no memory of what happens until I regain consciousness after the 3rd seizure that day. I woke up several hours later, in the evening. Meanwhile, what had happened was that I got to the hospital from the dentists, and they did a few tests but were unaware I had had a seizure in my sleep. They sent me home. I was with my dad on the way back, and the 3rd seizure hit me. It gave my dad PTSD to see me like that. He was on the highway, turned around, and drove 90 miles per hour back to the hospital. I wake up in the ICU at 6 or 7 p.m. My body felt like I had run 3 marathons. Every single muscle was so sore that I could barely move. The first day, I couldn't get up and walk without people helping me. I was only there 3 days, and they ran all sorts of tests. Meanwhile, I don't have insurance, and I managed to incur a $20,000 medical debt. After talking to the right person after months of trying, we got the hospital to drop the $12,000 they were charging us. The MRI guys and such didn't count. $8,000 in the hole isn't too bad. And, well, I'm still alive. It's not as directly close to death as others may have experienced, I'm sure, but for me, I know I'm damn lucky to be alive. I could have had those seizures while I was driving and killed both myself and someone else. I was in a car accident when I was 18. I was coming home from visiting a girlfriend at college who lived about 3 hours away. It was wet, and I hydroplaned and panicked. I spun out and smashed into a guardrail and rolled over it because, at the time, I was driving a very top-heavy GMC Jimmy. Anyway, I happened to be driving up an overpass, so I ended up rolling down an embankment and partially onto another interstate. I ended up being sidetracked by a family van full of kids. The family was fine, but I, on the other hand, no pun intended, had managed to get my arm about torn off. Literally, my arm was only connected by a partially torn artery and some gross-looking skin. So, I sat upside down and watched myself bleed out for about 2 minutes. I screamed at first, but then there was this calm that I'll never forget. I was just thinking about really unimportant shit. I remember thinking about the fact that my SNES was in the back and that it was probably ruined. I guess I figured I was going to die, so I just sat there quietly until the paramedics arrived a bit later. But I didn't die. Instead, I enjoy limited mobility of my right hand because my awesome-ass surgeon and good friend managed to sew my shit back on. I've got some crazy cool scars, though. And I can still play guitar, sort of. About 6 years ago, I was in the Dominican Republic on vacation with my fiancée. I woke up the first morning at about 8 a.m. with heartburn but thought it was nothing and went out to the beach. Around noon, the pain got worse, and I went back to the room. I tried to get some sleep, but the pain became unbearable. I ran to the drugstore they had at the resort and bought a thermometer and some Pepto. I was running a 103 at that point, and the Pepto did nothing. Finally, around 6 p.m., I went to the resort doctor. Prelim test showed appendicitis. They called an ambulance, and it got there around 9 p.m. They arrived at the hospital around 10, and they wanted to run some tests. They took x-rays, you need an MRI to truly show appendicitis, and then said, we will wait till tomorrow morning for the doctor to get here before doing anything. He has left for the night. They also would not give me any painkillers. They put me in a hospital bed that had ants crawling all over me. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, the doctor got in around 11 a.m. I have now had appendicitis for 27 hours with no relief. The doctor stops by and says, well, it could be appendicitis, but it may not be. Well, by this point, I was fed up. I pulled out my own IVs and caught a cab to the airport. My fiancée went to the hotel and packed our things up. We caught a flight back to Charlotte, North Carolina. I should have gone to the hospital there, but I decided I was a hard ass and could make the extra 2 hours back home to Louisville, Kentucky. I got to the hospital in Kentucky, and they immediately rushed me to surgery. The surgeon said my appendix was on the cusp of bursting. It was about 48 hours from the time the symptoms started to the time they got it out. I have been shot 5 different times but never hit. The closest, and the one that I can still see very clearly to this day, was the last time I was shot at. Me and 3 of my friends were walking to another friend's house just down the street. We lived in front of a freeway entrance, and a car getting on the ramp yelled something out of the car. The car stops on the on-ramp and hits reverse. Growing up, we were used to gangs harassing us, and we knew if we ran, they would think we were from another gang. The car pulls up next to us in less than 10 seconds. The passenger asks if we were from some gang, and we say no. He obviously did not believe us and pulled out a chrome .38, aims right at me, about 3 feet away, and unloads. I start running along with my other friend. I hear bullets whizzing by my head and hitting the metal fence next to us. We keep running, and we hear the car speed off. My friend and I stop and notice that our other 2 friends are not with us. We run back and see both of them lying on the street, face down. One gets up first, then the other one. They both dove and stayed on the ground while we ran. One of them caught a bullet on his toe and on his arm. Both must have been ricochets because they did not penetrate that deeply into him. Anyway, that was the 5th damn time I was shot at, but it's the one I remember coming closest to death. I never joined a gang. I just grew up in a shitty area of Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s. I strangled myself with my umbilical cord. Came out blue. I was 9. I was really sick, and my parents were giving me saltines and ginger ale, both of which I hate. So I put the crackers beneath the couch and the ginger ale into a plant. I didn't drink or eat for nearly 3 days before they figured it out, coupled with throwing up whatever bile my stomach produced. I can vaguely remember my dad carrying me in his arms and running screaming into the ER. I was 10 or 11. I was hesitant to jump off a 15-foot platform into a really deep natural spring I was visiting. Terrified, I started to back away, but someone got the better idea to push me. Falling and desperate, I gripped the ladder on the way up, which only served to pull my shoulder out of the socket, so when I hit the water, I was in so much pain I'd gone into a state of shock. I fell from such a height that I went about 10 feet under and breathed in. I remember feeling like I was sinking, though I know that's not true. The lifeguard pulled me out and got the water out of my lungs. I know I was unconscious for a short amount of time, but my memory is purely of having literally just lain there, eyes wide. I was 17. Bored. Lit a fire on a pretty seldom used street. I stomped it out when the occasional car came by. No car came by. The fire got big. The car started speeding up with no lights on. I barely saw it. I tried to stomp the fire out, but my pants and shoes caught on fire. I went through the ditch and got grazed. I was 18. Driving home from a friend just dropped her off. T-boned by a guy going 80. Passenger side was obliterated, the car spun like a top, then went into the ditch. I blacked out, and when I woke up and saw the wreckage, I started to scream, but all I could do was choke up glass and blood. I was 19. Streets of New York. This is my first time visiting. A little jumpy, I was afraid to cross the street when my friend and veteran New Yorker did. So I waited just another second before stepping off. A construction worker working on the sidewalk grabbed me and yanked me back off the road. My arm was flailing forward, and my hand literally touched the car. I was 20. Crossing a road at my university. We had the green, but people could still turn. One such guy, a maintenance worker for the university, in a big van, did not stop. Instead, he tried to beat me and my friend and managed to hit her in the face with his mirror. I was lucky enough to jump back.